So I offer 3 case studies in the bioenergy nexus. One is a project in Malawi on bioethanol from sugarcane, more specifically from the molasses, which is a byproduct from the sugarcane industry. Don't look at the smaller lines, the smaller text. It is just for the records to show what is in it. So biofuel production in Malawi from ethanol is from molasses. It is an existing project, so it is a 20-year-old production chain which is already existing. So you can look at longer-term impacts of the chain and not on projections. They are both large-scale, so we also have the connection to the large-scale investments in land. There are intentions to expand the sugarcane estate, so we also have a land-grabbing element in this case study. The market for this bioethanol is local, it's not for the international market. There is a local demand for it. It is blended into petrol. The ecological conditions in Malawi are quite favorable for agriculture, high precipitation, but we have a very high population density, so cash crops in these countries are really, in some terms, competing with food production. The actors in this case study would be foreign investors with a long-term agriculture experience. We have a number of small-scale farmers which do subsistence, which some of them provide are also contract farmers for the estates, so they provide sugar into the mill. Many of these small-scale farmers work as permanent or temporary workers in the mills, in the production. So we have 2 effects here. One is via production, one is via wages on poverty. The third one would be via food prices. We are trying to look what are the effects on local food prices. We have local communities, and differentiated from this, so we have traditional leaders. It's not always the same. So we have local governance systems which are very often in conflict with the official and public ones. And we have the national ministries, and we have plenty of them which are involved in bioenergy. It's agriculture, it's energy, it's trade and industries, and some others which have a word to say in how bioenergy policies are shaped. What is also, I think, very important if you look into these issues is what are the alternative uses. As you have talked here about different renewables which have their different prices, and some of them are not competitive. In the agricultural area, you would have to look at the alternative uses of the different resources. The land you can use for your subsistence and some cash crop production, but in Malawi you have marketing problems for many of these alternative products. Water, there is limited alternative use up to now. There is some irrigation of other crops, but it's very limited. So biofuel producer, the large estate, is the only larger user of water for the moment, but I think that could change in the future if you have more large-scale investors who are looking for this irrigation water. And for the labor, you have subsistence and some cash crops, but basically these people have, as an alternative for cash income, they have migration into cities and into the region like South Africa. Completely different picture is Namibia, the second case study. That is only a planned, it is not realized, it has not failed, but it is stalled. The government 2 weeks ago now has said we stop all these large-scale investment projects. There were up to 400,000 hectares of heterophyte production in the pipelines of individual investors. That was too hot for the government, so they stopped it for the time being. The ecological conditions are very poor, 400 to 600 millimeters of rainfall. So there is very low productivity outside, let's say, this potential Jatropha case, which has technical problems to deal with this low precipitation. But also Namibia has very, very low population density. So the alternatives also are very few. So alternative food crops without irrigation are mainly millet. But more or less it's extensive livestock keeping. and nothing else. With irrigation you can do almost everything, but there are no markets in the northern parts of Namibia. So basically this water is unused, water from the Zambezi and from the Okavango. But there are other restrictions in the Okavango, I will come to that. Because these are international waters, so for the Okavango you have a quite active international treaty between Angola, Namibia and Botswana. For the Zambezi you have something similar, but which is not, let's say, active, it is not really implemented, but for the Okavango it is. So actors here are also investors, some with, but most of them without any agricultural experience. That was, I think, one of the main reasons why many of these projects failed or were, planned. They were planned without knowledge of the agricultural solidity which is necessary. And as you know, most of the Jatropha projects all over the world failed because exactly of that. It was a completely overestimation of the yields which could be achieved with Jatropha. Other actors that we have is these small-scale livelihoods. I don't call them anymore farmers because in Namibia they cannot live from food production alone, so most of them have mixed incomes. Working in such a plantation would be an additional one, but many also are migrants. We have local communities, traditional leaders, and again national ministries. Alternative uses in Namibia are different. For land it is wildlife and tourism, which is the most important alternative use if you don't go for, let's say, in this case, biofuel or extensive cattle herding. For water, it is ecosystems, tourism again, some irrigation of other crops with the marketing problem attached. And for labor, it is migration. It is, I think, in Namibia as a middle-income country, subsistence farming is no longer an option for most of the people there. The third case study that I have to offer is bush to energy uses. There is an encroachment problem in the central of Namibia, about 20 million hectares large. And this bush can be converted into different kinds of energy. Traditional is the use for charcoal production, so solid biofuel. More innovative ones are briquettes for the local and for international markets, and gasification and electrification, and feeding this electricity into the grid. We have, on the output side, we have marketing, we have investor contracts, internationally policies which influence trade, like investment and trade policies. And a very important context in the African context is corporate social responsibility, because as less you have a regulating, working, operating government, I think you need corporate social responsibility to buffer, let's say, the lack of ability of the government to influence the outcomes. And now just some propositions, last slide, for governance issues in this, from these different areas, from these different policy areas. One is in agriculture. Well, the first one is agriculture. We observe a neglect of bioenergy crops by government in research, extension, and public services. So the governments in these countries, even in Malawi, where there is a 20-year-old positive success story, governments have neglected that, they have left it to the private sector, which means they don't have capacities, let's say, to steer, for example, new investors, or to create competition, to attract new ones, because they simply do not have the data, they do not have extension services which can help farmers and investors to do the same, and to expand. Another governance issues is the relation between large estates and small farmers. This happens under private contracts, but of course there is a role for the public, because small farmers are obviously not able to deal on an equal footing with investors, with large investors. So you need a helping hand for farmer organizations. And second, the third governance issue in agriculture is it is an open sector, which with many policy instruments, agriculture policies, trade, poverty, food security, industrial policies, macroeconomic policies like exchange rates, all govern prices, and prices are the most important incentives and disincentives for this kind of energy production. Second area of governance is water. As I said, all three cases are international water streams where irrigation water is taken from. Some with Okavango and Zambezi are two cases where we have an international governance scheme around the water, and one without. The Shiro River in Malawi, as far as I know, doesn't have an international treaty. It's only two countries, Malawi and Mozambique, which are concerned. We have no traditional, but only some modern private irrigation schemes. So we have a lack, let's say, of experience in how to govern irrigation projects. That is also the reason why in all three countries irrigation is preferably by the government handed over to the private investors, even with the conditionality to provide some of this water to smaller farmers. So that is like a public-private partnership contract. We have the third topic is in Malawi. There is hardly any existing water use planning, whereas in Namibia, I think Namibia is quite advanced in this topic because it's the most water scarce country, at least in Sub-Saharan Africa, so they have been forced to go so. For other ecological issues, we have the on-site effects of land use systems like soil degradation or the density of trees, the species of trees which are left over in the fields, is under mixed governance responsibilities, farmers as private actors, but also Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Environment, and for formal externalities like natural resources, natural forests, for wildlife, for water pollution, we have ministries of environment and tourism in Namibia. In Malawi, I think there is no, or maybe there is a similar organization. In Malawi, the environment is put together with energy, interestingly. So a different governance structure. For integrated natural resource planning, doesn't hardly exist in both of these countries. For large land transfers, there is, as I said, in Namibia, in Malawi and Namibia, we have the typical case is that we have communities with traditional authorities which deal with the private investors. In southern Namibia, we have private investors and private land ownership, private farmers which can deal directly with private energy producers. Extremely complicated, you all know that we have multi-level, multi-sectoral, mixed land transfer systems, which makes it extremely difficult in most African cases to acquire larger tracts of land. And finally, there is an existing obligation to conduct environmental and social impact assessments for such larger land transfers, the degree to which they are really operational, and how they can deal with, let's say, if several investors occupy a country is not yet solved. So individual impact assessments are fine, but what would be needed is systemic impact assessments, and that hasn't been solved. And finally, for the output markets, the electricity in Namibia is linked to the national grid, so you need infrastructure policies. You can only produce for the grid if there is a grid, and in most African countries you don't have grids. In addition, you need feed-in laws like we have in Europe. In Namibia there is a feed-in law, but no additional price incentive for this feed-in, so you need to regulate that. The regional institutions can be quite complicated. In Namibia they have separated the central supplier of energy from the local supplier in order to facilitate the local feed-in, because a central supplier seems to be not interested. For bioethanol in Malawi, we have a national blending law, we need fuel standards and a regional ethanol market, and obviously all these areas are heavily governed and regulated by states. So this is a screw where you can give incentives or disincentivize the production and thereby investors. And finally, for biodiesel, that was theoretically aimed at Europe, at the European market. So for this area, the Renewable Energy Directive and the national applications were, I think, the key drivers for this market. In addition, you have fuel standards, emerging national blending, and you have isolated users. Many larger farmers, or for example the mining industry, are interested in having a local supply of diesel. And that could also be an interesting market. Again, you have some governance problems there concerning quality and inspection, for example. Thank you.